So, for tonight, I want to spend a good portion of the time, even though it's been a while, closing up Elisha, because I think we left a few things unsaid, or maybe said, but maybe I'll say things a little differently than might have been said. And then, if I have time, really we'll run through the gamut a little bit, just very quickly, of some of the leftover perakim and Melachim, which seem to take a very different style, right? Post Elisha, we start seeing this rapid, almost confusing movement of kings and their actions, good, bad, and it's hard to remember who was good, who was bad. And we have this overlap of Yehuda kings and Yisrael kings, and he was good and he was bad. And then we go back in time because when he came to the throne, he was still in king. We buried a king, and then we talk about him again, relevant to the Yehuda king. So things get a little confusing. And that really goes with minor stops until the destruction of Shomron. Right, and then of course, when we're only left with Yehuda, we go back to a more clear narrative style where it comes to the discussions of Hizkiah and Menashe and Ammon and Yoshiyahu, and leading all the way to the destruction from perakim till the end. So, but again, as I said, I really want to spend a lot of time on closing up Elisha. Now, the first and the biggest question of Elisha, which we'll call the missing 27 years, right? In other words, Elisha seems to disappear from the scene after the reign or the ascension of Yehu. Yehu comes, he crowns him. We have this shift for two perakim for the first time in a very long time to some confusing elements in Yehuda with Atalia and her son and this whole mess. And then we go back to Yisrael in Perik Yud Gimel. So again, in Perik Yud, we have really the ascension to the throne on the part of Yehu. And then we have Yud Aleph and Yud Bet shifting the scene to Yehuda. We come back in Perik Yud Gimel, where we have pretty much back to Yisrael, but very quickly in the middle of the Perik, we then see Elisha is dying. And he will then instruct the king, right, that who's subjugated clearly by Aram, in a very harsh way. And if we'll remember, Elisha cried when he told Hazael that he would take over from his master Ben-Hadad because of the destruction that he would ravage on Yisrael. And so Elisha is now dying, and he has this interesting episode of shooting the arrows, hitting the floor with the king, and then of course the Tehayat HaMetim after he dies, right? And then as I mentioned, we have this speedy, quick king after king, Yehuda, and Yehuda and Yisrael. So, really, what happened to Elisha? Where did he go? He crowned Yehu, and then he disappears. This has led some to make an interesting assumption, and they turn to the style of En Mukdam U'Me'uhar Batura, right? And they say, as was said last Saturday night by Professor Liebtag, they say, you know what? All of the stories about the anonymous king, right? Perek, in perakim, Vav, right? He and Vav, the story about the anonymous king, basically with the Naaman story, right? And the Hayil of Aram, getting them B'Sanverim, the saving of Shomron from the Matzor of Ben Hadad. Now here's the trick. There's a problem here because there are two Ben Hadads that are king of Aram. One is before Hazael and one is after Hazael. So naming the king doesn't solve my problem. And so they basically say all of those stories was not Yehoram ben Ahav, but rather was a king in the house of Yehu. Right? Yehu himself, his son, whatever it is. They'll point with minimal proofs, but they'll point to some of the following points that they might say to prove that point, right? And they would say, and therefore, there is no lapse because really Elisha was active, but the psukim are just out of order. The perakim are out of order, and he was active after the coronation of Yehu, and those are the stories. That Melech Yisrael, those are the stories. And you have this en mukdam mehar b'Torah that they happened to the house of Yehu, even though later on Yehu is again crowned king. So, in order to prove that, they point to some textual evidence. And some of the points they point is like this. If you go to Perek Gimel, Pasuk Yud Gimel, Yehoram, right, and Yoshaphat are in this war together. And Yoshaphat says, listen, you need a navi Hashem. I'm not going to war with you unless we... So they call Elisha, comes, Vayomer Elisha el Melech Yisrael, Ma li velach? What do I have to do with you? Lech el Nevi'ei avicha vel Nevi'ei mecha. Go to that. Vayomer lo Melech Yisrael, al, ki kara Adonai l'shloshet hamelachim ha'ele letet otam biyad Moav. Let's don't do that. So he says, you know what? He says, like, please. I wouldn't even look at you if it was Yehoshaphat. So that's Yehoram. Now, the king that we see later in perakim, in the later perakim, the anonymous Melech Yisrael seems to enjoy a pretty good relationship with Elisha, right? They talk to each other. Elisha does. It's true. He does rebuke him, but he calls him Avi. In other words, he advises him. He helps him save the situation. So that's it shows that this might not be Yehoram. Look how he talks to Yehoram here, and look how he's talking to that Melech Yisrael. So how could you say that Melech Yisrael is Yehoram? Another point is if we go later on in that time of Melech Yisrael, we see that the king is definitely subjugated to the king of Aram, right? That Melech Yisrael at that point, right? Vayihi aharichen ben Vav kaf daled vayikbotz ben Hadad melech Aram et kol machaneo vayal vayasar al Shomron. Right? He puts a matzor on Shomron with ease. Now, we know in the time of Yehoram that doesn't happen so quickly. The house of Ahav is a strong house. And what seems to happen during the time of the reign of the house of Ahav is that we don't see Yisrael subjugated to Aram so quickly. So the ease of which all of these military battles that happen throughout the rest of Perek Vav and well into Perek Zayin, and the fear and the subjugation and sometimes the trepidation of Melech Yisrael in the face of the king of Aram doesn't seem to put it that this should be a king in the house of Ahav. Right? The kings of the house of Ahav, as we said, they were aligned with sword. They were strong militarily. Aram was weak at that point. There would be no reason for us to assume that this is a pre-Hazael situation. Right? That this Ben-Hadad would be a later Ben-Hadad, and therefore, that's why they were militarily subjugated to Aram, because they are, this is out of order. Okay. And therefore, Elisha doesn't disappear. The miracles are just placed in different order. Now, you'll ask the obvious question, why? Why would the Nevi do such a thing? Why would he place them out of order? Right? So, it's, the proponents of this theory don't really answer that question so much. Last Saturday night, Professor Liebtag didn't really, he just asserted it as understood, right? This is Yehoram, this is not Yehoram, this is and didn't really defend it. The only assumption you would have to make then, and which is pointed out, and we won't go into it, is that the connection between chapters is thematic, right? And they'll point to the themes of the miracles, that it was the miracles of Elisha, and they'll point also to a parallel to the Eliyahu narrative and the development of the miracles. So that the text is therefore putting, it's really not about the king at all. It's about Elisha's miracles compared to Eliyahu's miracles. And so therefore the chronology, it's not really chronology so much, it's more about Elisha thematically. And then we move on back in time to the Yehoram story, okay? And we move back to Yehoram, and then we deal with the kings. So the first chunk of the perakim in Melachim Bet are not about kings. It's about Elisha. And I don't care who the king is, and that's why the king is anonymous. It's all about his miracles. And therefore the king is unimportant because it's really about the development of Elisha as a leader of a navi Yisrael. And therefore, and we'll get back to the king story when we go back in time where Yehu deposes Yehoram, and then we now talk about not Elisha anymore. As I mentioned, Elisha is no longer mentioned. Rather, we'll talk about whom? The kings. We'll go back to the kings. We'll go back to Yehoram and his situation. Then we'll flip to Yehuda with Atalya and her kid and that situation. Then we'll flip back. And by the way, we'll mention Elisha's death. And we move more in the chronology of kings. Okay? That's that theory. And like I said, that theory does have one benefit. If that's true, we don't have to assume Elisha went into early retirement. Or if we assume he didn't go into early retirement, we'd wonder why he no longer appears anymore. Again, Yehu and his son, and by the time of Yoash, and that's when Elisha dies, we have a chunk of years that none of his activities are mentioned, and we assume he was active, right? We assume he was active because if he wasn't active during the reign of Yehoram and his children, why would the king, who, if the last time he did anything was close to 30 years ago, why would he cry and call him Rechev Yisrael? Obviously, the king did rely on him, so he must have been active. So if he was active, why is it not recorded in the text? So this is one theory. It has its proponents. It's a modern theory. You don't find any source for this in ancient, as far as I know, in Rishonim. You don't find it certainly you don't find it in Hazal. And even earlier sources seems to knock this out. Josephus himself has commentary here, and he he seems to take it in chronological order. And most of the traditional commentaries seem to say that this is in chronological order. We'll remember and we'll go back right to the Ramban, our famous Ramban, who says that we have to assume yesh mukdamu me'ohar b'Torah unless there's a compelling reason for which Hazal then removed it out of the order, right? So we would assume that yesh mukdamu me'ohar b'Torah. Okay, so if we don't want to do that, and there's good enough reasons not to do it, again, the Hazal, all the ancient commentaries don't seem to do that, and aside of this, the burden on the proof is taking it out of its chronological, because everything else is in chronological order. All of Elisha's life, if aside of these 2-3 chapters, are in very specific chronological order, from the time he meets Eliyahu to the time he leaves Eliyahu's death, where he becomes coronated in Bet and Gimel, and the kings are clearly mentioned, and his death is placed in its chronological order, and his crowning of Yehu is placed in chronological order. So all of a sudden, to remove these two, it's difficult. Also, a few just points to point out that seem to indicate again that it would be in chronological order, because if we go to Het Zayin, right, is where Elisha goes to Damascus. And what is he about to do there? This is, by all accounts, before Hazael is appointed as king. Okay? This is Ben Hadad, Melech Aram, is Holeh. Okay? And this is before Yehu is crowned. So this, right? This is before Yehu is crowned. ויבוא אלישע דמשק ובן הדד מלך ארם חולה. ויוגד לו לאמור, בא איש האלוהים עד הנה. The איש אלוהים came. ויאמר המלך אל קח בידך מנחה, ולך לקראת איש אלוהים, ודרשת את אדוני מאותו לאמור, האחיה מחולי הזה. Now, look at the reception that Elisha receives in Aram by the first Ben Hadad. Now, we must assume that Elisha has already done what I'll call Aramean miracles to receive this type of reception by the king of Aram. If he's some Jewish navi that hasn't done anything yet, doesn't make sense. In fact, when he hasn't done miracles yet, the first time we meet up with him, or the first time Aram meets up with Elisha, what do? They treat him like a nothing. Naaman rebukes him. Right? The king doesn't even ask. He sends him to the king of Yisrael to go and command, so to speak, the navi to do to take the sarat of Naaman away. In other words, and you'll see they try and kill him later. You'll see very clearly that in the beginning, they don't view him as very important. So, it's strange if I take it out of chronological order. Ben Hadad, who has never seen him yet, doing any miracles yet for Aram, has all this respect for him. Right? Unbelievable. And many years later, right? He's then, when they finally need him to do miracles, they treat him like a nobody. It doesn't make sense. Here, he should not be accorded such respect if he hasn't done anything yet. And certainly, after he's predicted and he's crowned Hazael king, the miracles that came later should not be predicated on a lack of respect. It makes much more sense to assume the normative chronological order. That what? That initially they didn't know him. Therefore, he wasn't accorded respect from the Aramean court. And then by now, when he's done a lot to Aram, remember, he's captured a garrison, he's blinded them, he cured Naaman from his leprosy. Aram now knows him. Okay, now Ben-Hadad, who's a contemporary of Yehoram, would say, oh, okay, this guy, he's here and I'm sick, he's a guy we want to talk to. So this Kabbalat Panim shows that he's probably done stuff for Melech Aram, and it's therefore difficult to take it out of the context of the chronological setting. So therefore, that's a difficulty with that. That's a difficulty with that. It's not easy. Now, also, just some comparisons to the Yehoram we know is Yehoram. If you go to Perek Gimel, Pasuk Yud, right? Yehoram seems to be a panicker, right? And there's a war. וידך מלך יהודה מלך אדום ויסובו דרך שבעת ימים ולא היה מים למחנה ולבהמה אשר ברגליהם, and then all of a sudden ויאמר מלך ישראל, כי קרא אדוני לשלושת המלכים לתת אותם ביד מואב. We're finished. Right? This is the same story. This is Yehoram clearly. And then they call Elisha, and of course Elisha rebukes him. In other words, in extreme panic, right away. If you go to Perek He, Pasuk Zayin, Melech Yisrael, ויהי כקרוא מלך ישראל את הספר ויקרא בגדיו ויאמר אלוהים אני להמית ולחיות כי זה שולח לעשות משבצותו כי יראו כי מתענהו לי. Panic. Immediate panic. And in both cases, they panic. And it's Elisha, after the panic, who's called to the scene and who calms things down. So it seems to be a similar reaction on the part of the king, right? And you'll find that this is how the king, right? You'll find that this is how he sort of reacts, and he has this disbelief of that anything can get better, right? And he has a certain pessimism to him. And that fits. Right, you'll find later in Zayin Yud Bet, after the case of the Arba Mitzoraim, the Vayakom Melech La Vayomer Avada Bagidan Alachem Et Asher Asu Lanu Aram Yadu Kerevim Anachnu V'Yatzu Min Ha'Hamar Lehabeh Basadeh Ki Yatzu Min Ein. He's not willing to believe in the salvation so quickly. He doesn't believe in it. He thinks things are not good, right? He doesn't have that belief in the navi or in the ability to make things better. This king will even threaten to take the head off of the Nevi. So it seems to fit that it should be Yehoram that we're talking about. And I will say one more point to this. If you go to after, right, when Perik Vav. So go to Perik Vav Pasuk Lamed. We'll read a few psukim. Right? Now, the king was just told this horrific story. We don't have to go over it. You'll remember it. The horrific story about the lady. They cooked her kid, and then she wants the other one, and not giving it. So the king is he's distraught by what he hears. Again, the same, by the way, the same pain, the same immediate emotional reaction. It fits with the Yehoram. He swears, right? Now this is this Melech Yisrael that we want to assert is Yehoram. But if we take it out of chronological order, we're going to assert this is not Yehoram, but this is who? This is either Yehu or a child of Yehu. Well, it's very difficult because look what he calls him. ואלישע יושב בביתו והזקנים יושבים איתו וישלח איש מלפניו בטרם יבוא המלאך אליו והוא אומר לזקנים הראיתם כי שלח בן המרצח הזה להסיר את ראשי? Now, it's very difficult for us to assume that Elisha called the son of Yehu ben Amratzeah. We know that Yehu wasn't a great guy, didn't work out well, but there's no question he crowned him. He did what he was supposed to do. Who is the Miratzeah? Who is the Miratzeah? When we hear Miratzeah, who do we think of right away? It's got to be a Hav. Haratzahta vegam yarashta. To assume this is not Yehoram, that it's a son of Yehu, a grandson of Yehu. Why we call him Ben Amratzeah? We don't see. We see they're not following Hashem, but Ritziha is something that we seem to reserve from who? For a Hav. Haratzahta v'gam yarashta. So again, there seems to be textual proof that the assertion that it's not Yehoram is difficult. That the assertion is that it's out of context is hard to maintain. Okay, so now we go back to our original question. Right? Now, the taking it out of chronological order was for a few reasons. One, again, it seems to be that Elisha and Yehoram don't have the greatest relationships. Well, that's not such a proof because we could say their relationship got better. In other words, or at some point Yehoram learned to deal with the navi, right? Even this Melech Yisrael is threatening to take his head off. They didn't have a great relationship all the time. And with the question of the military strength of Aram, it could be that things were getting worse already during the time of Yehoram, and that might be, as Rabbi Liebtech pointed out, which would have caused the waning in popularity of the house of Ahav. Could be they already had some military losses. We don't have to wait till Yehu to do that, right? Although, right, you had a whole elaborate thing that the strength of the house of Ahav, and only it waned in the time of Yehu. Yeah, that's very nice. You could do that when you take it out of context. In other words, your proof is what you said. Well, it can't be they were weak in the time of Ahav. Why? Well, because these nibuot that say they were weak are not in context. And why are they not in context? Because they weren't weak. In other words, it's a bit circular reasoning. Just assume that there's chronological order to the perakim, and yes, they weakened in that time. So the proofs are not strong. The proofs the other way seem to indicate certain textual proofs that it is Yehoram and that the perakim are in chronological order. There doesn't seem a reason to be taking them out of chronological order. All of this classical mefarshim took it in chronological order. The Seder HaOlam took it in chronological order. Josephus and Antiquities took it in chronological order. To assume reasons to take it out of its context and make it into a Yehu king with no seeming reason, everything else is in chronological order, is difficult and I think unnecessary. But now we got to go back to the point: where is Elisha? So now we need the bigger question, which is, where is Elisha for 27 years? I think that's the number, right? what happens. So we're going to now have to take a step back and think about things. Who crowns Yehu? Who crowns Yehu? Yeah, it's funny. Who crowns Hazael? Elisha directly. Right? All the way to Meseh. Who crowns Yehu? A nod. So you might say, yeah, of course. It's Mored b'malchut, he's scared. And Ben Hadad, he wasn't. He's crowning Hazael. Right. Okay, it's true. And okay, so you could say it was a fear. And by the way, I don't doubt that there's a fear because the nod runs away. He's told, so there is a fear. I mean, this is Miridah b'malchut, right? You're crowning another king. It's a certain Miridah b'malchut, and the nod runs away fast. They think he's a nutcase. Even the officers around you who think he's crazy. So yes, I would not doubt there's a certain danger, and there's no doubt there's a certain danger in Elisha himself going. That would be, Elisha is at this point a very popular person. If Elisha himself visits Yehu, it's a pretty dangerous thing. Even one of the navi, one of those bnei Nevi'im that actually goes, has to do it secretly and has to get out there. So it makes sense that that Elisha himself doesn't do it, right? But that he sends the na'ar to do it. But the al-sheikh has a bit of a different perush. The al-sheikh says, you know why he didn't want to crown Yehu himself? There's another reason why he didn't crown Yehu himself. And that is because he was friendly with Yehoram. Yehoram was nichna to Elisha so many times. And he knows that he's got a divine mission by crowning Yehu, which is going to have his friend killed. I'm over-exaggerating the al-sheikh's point. Friend is is not really a friend, but he certainly is, if you take those stories of Melech Yisrael as Yehoram, he's certainly someone that has kini'ah to Elisha, right? Remember, Elisha doesn't have a problem personally with the house of Ahav, right? The kings that he deals with, nobody tells him, I'm going to kill you. He doesn't have this problem. So all of a sudden, for him now to have to crown Yehu to destroy the house of Ahav might have been a painful thing for him to do. And the al-sheikh says he may not have been so excited about it. And this is really not his battle. Whose battle was this? This is Eliyahu's battle against the house of Ahav. In fact, it was God who told Eliyahu that Yehu will be crowned. This isn't even his mission, so to speak. So, says the al-sheikh, he just sends this nod to do it. And the al-sheikh goes further, and I'm not going to leave it here, but the al-sheikh goes further and he says, it may not be not only something he wasn't excited about doing, but it might have been almost bal korho, so to speak. Now, if that's true, let's think for a minute. When was the last time somebody, a very active navi, had to depose a king that he liked a lot and crown a king that he might not have been too excited about? Shmuel, right? Shmuel. And what happens after Shmuel crowns David? We really don't hear much of Shmuel. Aside of one or two incidents, he goes into this semi-retirement. We don't hear much of him. Aside of having to save David a few times. Right? We don't hear about Shmuel. He all of a sudden disappears. We hear him one time saving David because David runs to him. And then we just hear he dies. Very similar here to Elisha. So it might be possible that because he wasn't thrilled about this mission, he now becomes the navi in semi-retirement, so to speak, or the navi who continues to do things on behalf of individuals, right? But advising these kings, maybe not, the Yehu kings. Maybe this is not something. So according to Al-Sheikh, his affinity for the house of Ahav may have been part of why he was experienced. But I want to take that and maybe develop it one notch further. And let's take a look. Does Yehu himself remind us of anybody? Well, let's take a look about Yehu. So I think the first thing, and I'm going to say this one, and this one will give it away. So, and then we'll prove it, instead of I was just like developing it and let you figure it on your own. Because once I say this one, so who's Yehu's name similar to? Right, Eliyahu, right, Yehu, right, similar. Now watch some of the similarities, which is striking. And in the crowning of Yehu and in the destruction of the house of Ahav, this is Elisha's job. Yehu should be referring all the time to what? To Elisha, right? But watch how Yehu talks, right? Watch how he speaks, and it's really interesting because remember, Eliyahu was commanded that Yehu ben Nimshi timlach lemelech, right? Al Yisrael. You were to crown him. Now, if you take a look at different parts in Perek Tet and in after Elihu, Yehu is crowned as a king, you see that there's this connection. Right after he killed Izebel, what does Yehu say? Right? Right. What does they say? Oh, this is like the Nibu. He tells his servant, right? Let's take a look here, because okay. Where is he talks to his servant? Just had the pasuk after he killed Izebel. Huh? Yeah. Right, but a little bit before that. Right? Right. This is what he said. Right? This is what he says. So he refers to the nibuah of Eliyahu, and it sounds like he knew about it. He literally might have been there at the point. He was an officer. He might have heard Eliyahu saying that. In other words, there's this connection, so to speak, between him and Eliyahu. It's, of course, as we mentioned, it's Eliyahu who seems to have been commanded to crown him. Now, watch something. I'm going to read Melachim. If you have two Tanachim, it would help. But if you don't, you'll flip. Or you could just listen. Melachim Aleph, right? Perek Kaf Aleph. Pasuk Kaf Aleph. Right? Ubi'arti harecha. V'hichrati lahav mashtin bakir. Ve'atzur ve'azuv b'Yisrael. Now, put your finger there. Flip to Melachim Perek Tet Het. This is the Na'ar talking. Ve'abed kol bet Ahav v'chrati le'ahav mashtin bekir ve'atzuv ve'azuv v'Yisrael. Now flip back. Kaf Aleph Kaf Bet. ונתתי את ביתך כבית ירבעם בן נבט וכבית בעשה בן אחיה. Now go to tet. ונתתי את בית אחיו כבית ירבעם בן נבט וכבית בעשה בן אחיה. Go back. וגם לאיזבל, מלכים א', גם לאיזבל דיבר השם לאמור, יאכלו אכלים בחלק ישראל ואין כובד. Going back to מלכים ב', ואת איזבל הכלבים יאכלו את איזבל בחיל ישראל. So the Nar's nevuah is word for word. Not the nevuah that Elisha on his own might say. This is Eliyahu talking. This is Eliyahu talking from the grave. This is exactly what he said to Av is being told to Yehu. And we already knew that he heard a lot of the nebuot of Eliyahu. Yehu may be hearing Eliyahu speaking in his mind. And of course, in Tet, Kaf Aleph, right, when Yehu comes, Vayihi kerot Yehu, Yerom et Yovayom Shalom Yehu, Vayomer Shalom al zinuzei Izebel imechel kshafei harabim. Right, he curses Izebel. And then he says, when he tells him, כי זכור אני את הרוכבים הצמדים אחרי אחיו אביו, ואדוני נשא עליו את המסע הזה. אם לא את דמי נבות ואת דמי בניו, ראיתי אמש נאום השם, ושילמתי לה בחלקה הזאת, in this חלקה, נאום השם, ואתה נשליחהו בלכתבר את השם. Right? This, he seems to be paying back all of this connection to the Kerem Navot that also goes back to the Nebuah of Eliyahu. Also, by the way, this concept of sitting and eating, Vayavo, Vayochel, Vayesh, right? Remember, after Izebel dies, they eat. What does that refer? In all of Tanakh, when you kill somebody and then you go and sit down and eat, what does that mean? Disrespect. It's disrespect. Right? It's who did that first? The brothers. They throw him in the pit and then they go eat. Right? Ahashverosh. They decree death and then they just sit down and eat and drink. Eating and drinking after a death or after a danger shows a lack of concern. Right? And there's no question that Yehu did that. He killed Izebel and then they went to eat. And then they almost cynically says, Pigduat alazot ki bat melech. Right? She's bat melech of Phoenicia, right? I just killed her, but she's a bat melech. So they eat and they drink. That reminds us of another incident. Who was told after he killed a lot of people to go eat and drink? That's Eliyahu's command to Ahav, right? After they killed all the Nevi'im Baal, what does Eliyahu tell him to do? Go and eat and drink. So, again, there's this connection between what happens here to with Yehu, and certainly to the Nebuot of Eliyahu, right? He tells, Ale echol ushte ki kol hamon geshem. Right? Go eat and drink. All these people that are dead, just go eat and drink. Right? So again, and again, like I said, the psukim in Lamed Hey, Vayegiv Vayomer Devar Hashem biyad asher diber biyad avdo Eliyahu tishbi. Right? So you have many situations where Eliyahu Navi is sort of coming back to life in this incident of Yehu. Right? And another last one is an important incident. If you go to Perek Yud, and I'm going to read through it very quickly. It's about 10 psukim, but I'm only going to read the whole thing. I'm not going to translate anything. I'm only going to read the whole thing because I want you to have a picture in your mind. If this picture is another incident. Perek Yud pasuk Yud Het. ויקבוץ יהוא את כל העם ויאמר אליהם, אחאב עבד את הבעל מעט, יהוא יעבדנו הרבה. This is deceptive. ואתה כל נביאי בעל, כל עבדיו, כל קראו אל האיש אל יפקד, כי זבח גדול לי לבעל. We're having a party. כי אשר יפקד לא יחיה. Any Baal worshiper, will, if he doesn't come to this party, Yehuda said, "Ukvad ma'amid of the Baal." He wants to destroy of the Baal. Vayomer Yehu kadshu atzara the Baal vayikrau. Now, he's being facetious. He's being a wise guy. We're gonna have this big part. Vayishlach Yehu b'chol Yisrael vayavo kol of the Baal v'lo nishar ish shlo vayavo bet Baal v'yoneh bet Baal pe lapeh. Says now, right? V'hotzei levush, to give them clothing. Vayavo Yehu v'yonadav b'nechah bet Baal v'yomer lo of the Baal. Hapesuru pen yesh po me'avdei Hashem ki mo'avdei lebal. I don't want any of the Hashem in this room. And they made zevahim, and then he says, and he kills them all. He kills all bet Baal, all of the Baal. He destroys them. So, vayashmed Yehu et Baal miYisrael. Who does this sound like? This really takes us back to Eliyahu and Har HaKarmel. This is the derech of Eliyahu, so to speak. This is the approach almost that Eliyahu brings to the forefront here. So the ghost of Eliyahu, the specter of Eliyahu, is living through many cases in the actions of Yehu, right? This is Eliyahu coming back, so to speak. And it shouldn't surprise us because the coronation of Yehu was initially the command to Eliyahu himself. Elisha is sort of doing it as to fulfill that command to Eliyahu. Yehu acknowledges this is all Eliyahu's nebuah. And if you add the al-sheikh that he wasn't even thrilled about it, right? About this having to do with it, it shouldn't surprise us here of Eliyahu's a little disappearance. Now, by the way, Elisha's disappearance. Now, there's in this chapter, this little portion that I just read, I told you in general, I want you to think in general about the comparisons, but linguistically, there are some also. I'll read to you. In Har HaKarmel, Shilach kebotz elai et kol Yisrael ve'et Nevi'im haBaal. V'yishlach ahav b'chol b'nei Yisrael. V'yikbotz Yehu et kol ha'am. V'ata kol Nevi'im haBaal kiru elai. V'yishlach Yehu b'chol Yisrael. Right, so you already see some language. Also, Vayhatil bahem Eliyahu. Yehu asa be'uqba. It's a ruse. Yeah, Eliyahu is also making a game. Oh, maybe he's sleeping. So it's two tricks. So there's, right? Eliyahu says, Tifsu et nevi'ei Baal, ish al yimalet mehem. Yehu says, Ha'ish asher yimalet min ha'anashim asher nevi al yedechem. Yehu is patterning himself after Eliyahu. If this issue is a Har HaKarmel issue. So A, we see it in general, but B, specifically the language. The language here is all Eliyahu. So, why does Elisha disappear? You could say, on a certain sense, and you might want to say, and some say, I think it's Professor Samet also advances this thing, that Elisha wasn't really happy about this thing. He makes a whole big deal, and we talked about it a little bit, about the Elisha and the Eliyahu differences, that their styles were so different, that their nibuot were different, their approaches to nibuah were so different. So, this is not something Elisha was happy about doing. He did it. He was commanded to do it. He was commanded by God to do it. He wasn't happy about it. Add that the al-sheikh that he pretty much didn't have any problems with Ahav, his family. I mean, I'm sure he didn't like them. They were Rishaim, right? But he dealt with them. Yehu, this is a firebrand. By the way, we do know that Yehu. How do we know Yehu is a firebrand? The text says it. Somebody, come on. That he was a wild guy. The text says it. Calls him a wild man. When he's riding crazy and they recognize him from far, that crazy riding is like Yehu, right? He's a wild guy, Right? You can imagine Elisha's approach, man. This is going to be the king. Avalma. This is, so you could say that Elisha was sort of not happy about this whole story. If I have to do it, I'll do it. But could be. So that's his thing. So I'm not saying that. I'm just, well, that's how he wants to say. And therefore, that's his sort of going out of it. I would say that it very well might be something else, which is not so different. What I'd like to offer a different approach, which is saying that it's not whether he's happy or not. We mentioned before that Elisha is a Talmid of Eliyahu, and that what Eliyahu wanted to happen tomorrow takes generations. But at this point, we're back to Eliyahu. In other words, the coronation of Yehu is really the hitkashmut of the nebuot of Eliyahu. What Eliyahu wants is the destruction of Beit Ahab. That's what he wants. He really wants the destruction of Izebel. But whatever he has no problems with destroying Ahab as well. In other words, that's his nemesis. Those are his enemies. He wants them destroyed. Elisha deals with them. He's not out, so to speak, to destroy them. So as long as they're around, you need an Elisha to handle them. Right? Eliyahu, he can't deal with these people. He can't deal with Rashaim. Elisha knows how to deal with them, as we see, very effectively. Once, however, the dream or the hitkashmut of the nibu'ah of Eliyahu comes into play, Elisha now is taking a back seat. The destruction of the house of Ahab, in other words, what Eliyahu really wanted is the right long-term goal. He may have wanted it too quickly. And so God says, you got to stop. It'll happen. Not in your lifetime. It'll happen. But I think I'm accepting your resignation. You have to crown Elisha. You have to crown Hazael. You have to crown Yehu. You got to do, this is who you're going to have to crown. In the meantime, Elisha deals with the house of Ahab. However, once the time is right for the Nibuah of Eliyahu to come true, the dream, so to speak, of Eliyahu to come true, Elisha's role, so to speak, is now given a back seat. It is now Eliyahu's vision which actually comes true. Now, I think this is important because very often we hear, and which disturbs me, is we get this Eliyahu bashing, right? Eliyahu is this, he didn't understand people, he's a wild man, he had to retire, we needed somebody else, we needed a calm guy like Elisha, who when he's called bald, he kills people, right? He's the calm guy, right? In other words, right? In other words, you get this like, oh, crazy Eliyahu, we got to get rid of him. We bring back the good Elisha. So, and I think that, I'm not saying there's some semblance of, minuscule amount of semblance in that text, of course, with the Lo Berash Hashem, of course, that, and they always quote that chapter. Lo Berash Hashem, about Kol Dmama Daka. I have no doubt that Hashem is telling Eliyahu something. But, as I mentioned earlier on, Elisha is a Talmid of Eliyahu. And I believe that Elisha's role was to continue that legacy. And the house of Ahab was an evil house that had to be obliterated. There was no question. Izebel had to be destroyed. So I think that sometimes we have that approach, which I think is not justified fully in that point. And that's why I think it's important to understand that really Yehu is the culmination of the Nevuah of Eliyahu. And so if Elisha disappears at this point, it's because what Eliyahu wanted to do then, which couldn't happen then, is happening now. Elisha's role is in the interim to get us there. In other words, and it's clear, the anointing of Elisha is coupled with the anointing of Hazael and the anointing of Elihu in the command. because they're all one and the same. Eliyahu would have liked nothing more than to appoint Yehu to kill Bet Ahav, but he can't do it. Elisha will do it. But in the meantime, we can't leave the people without a navi who gets along or who knows how to deal with the house of Ahav. So I don't think that Elisha was like upset about it. He might have, or maybe like the Al-Sheikh is correct, that since he dealt with it, he may have had maybe some personal issues, but I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is at this point, the text turns Elisha into the need for that nivuah is no more. And so therefore, Elisha takes a back seat. And the next time we'll see him, of course, is when he dies. And by the way, if you assume chronological order, we don't hear anything about Yisrael at all until that point. We do know very scant in the beginning of Perek Yud Gimel. We see a little bit of the fact that Yisrael is now taking back territory that was lost to Hazael, right? Once Hazael dies and Ben-Hadad is now crowned, so we see that they're starting to be ascendant and taking back the territory during Elisha's death. Now, we talk about we talk about the return, so to speak, of that. And I want to say a few points on that. We find in Elisha's death these interesting a double nivuah, right? The shooting of the arrow, which Elisha does with the king, and then the hitting on the ground. There's two nivuot that he does, and I think they personify. I think we have to re-engage the navi for one reason. Things don't go well during the time of Yehu. They don't go well in the time of his son either. And Yoash, right, is now, so to speak, appearing in front of the Nevi and at his death, and we're told that he goes to see him, and he cries, "Avi, Avi, Rechev Yisrael Parashav." So I would say, by the way, like I said before, that although that means that Elisha was active during this time. He's doing things. The king knows him. He was doing things. It's just not relevant for the text to record it. Everything I said before doesn't mean that Elisha went into retirement. It meant that the text is not recording because those things that he did are not relevant because now it's the hitkashmut of a nevuat Eliyahu. It doesn't mean he didn't do anything. Clearly, Yehu's son, right, is crying about him. Avi Avi Rechev Yisrael Parasha. By the way, of course, we know that where that came from, right? So clearly, there's this connection to the king and the Nevi, and he tells him Kach Keshet Hatzim Veikach, right? And then he says, just shoot the arrow, and then he says hit the Hatzim on the floor, and he hits him on the floor, but he only hits him 3 times. It's not enough. This would indicate that as things are going to get better for the house of Yehu against Aram, and we'll see very quickly that they will get better, even though the kings have not improved their ways, the Nevi is inserting himself and saying, and this is very important to Sefer Melachim, this is the action of God through his Nevi. This is not, and therefore Elisha's shooting the bows, that means that it's something that God has mandated. It's the prophecy of the Nevi. I'm here and doing it even if I'm dead. And in fact, it's the king's actions that actually fall short. Had it not been for the king's weakness, we'd get even more victories. Because again, they only get 3 victories and things like that. And then, of course, we'll see that Yoash's son, another Yeravam, we'll go back all the way. We'll bring back everything. And we'll find that all of the security comes back so that the Navi himself is somewhat still alive, ensuring these things happening. And in fact, also the resurrection story, in which the Met falls into Elisha's grave, and then he gets a Tahiyat HaMetim. So that resurrection story also has Eliyahu acting even from the grave. And is an interesting point about that story because it's a strange story. There's a few players here. Moab is a player, the Gdud of Moab, the buriers, Elisha, and the other dead guy. And it's very funny. We don't know what happens. The Gdud of Moab appears, and then we don't hear about them. The buriers, they drop him and they run away. We don't know what happens to them. We know this guy comes and gets up. We don't even know what happens to him. Some say he died right away. Hazal say he died right away. Right? And then what would be the point of him having Tahiyat HaMetim and then dying? So some say that Adak says just kavod of the kivod of Elisha. But I think you might be able to say something else. I think you might be able to say that you could just, and I can't say that this is what happened. It's just a supposition. But you could just imagine what happened. Right? The Gdud's coming. The people are running away. The dead guy falls in the kivod of Elisha, and then he comes back to life. And everyone's like, oh my gosh. Probably what happens is Moab runs. There's a living dead guy walking there. Moab runs away. The buriers are shocked, assuming that this is something that people see. And therefore, Elisha acts to repel the enemies even after his death. The points of the story, I think, are to bring the navi alive, so to speak, in an i.e. Eliyahu way, even after he dies. Again, Elisha is not like Eliyahu. He has a grave, he dies a natural death. Right, but there is some similarities, and I think it's very important for the navi to hear, or for the people to hear, that the navi is working for their salvation even after he dies. And that the salvation that they'll get is through Borei Olam and through God. And that's the whole point of Sefer Melachim. I'd like to mention a few things, only because I'm not going to get a chance to mention some of these stories, and if it's not so related to what I wanted to say, but just to catch up some ground of some of the interesting stories that happen in between. When we talk about there's an interesting pasuk when we talk about the destruction of Yisrael. In the middle of this, we insert a pasuk and says what? And Yehuda was also very bad. If you remember that story, you just read it yesterday, right? And what's that pasuk doing there? I think what that pasuk is doing there is saying. So that's what some say. I don't think so. I think what they're doing is, in the inquisitorial documents that Ferdinand and Izebel signed, why they expelled the Jews, is because they said that the conversos were not being good Christians. Because why? Because the Jews were influencing the conversos. We've got to get rid of the Jews. In other words, in a certain sense, the initial problems that happened to Yehuda are because the text claims to say, and it says it every time, they imitate Yisrael. And so I think over there in the destruction, it may be talking not about the sins of Yehuda for the sins of Yehuda, but the sins of Yehuda as part of the sins of Yisrael. Perakim Yud Aleph and Yud Bet are very interesting. We have Atalia. Who is Atalia? Who's her mommy and daddy? Well, her parents are Ahav and Izebel. Atalia, she's an interesting woman, right? She decides to destroy all her family, kill them all. And one person from the Zera Amlucha will live, hidden by Yehoyada Kohen, by his aunt, and by Yehoyada Kohen, and by the entire Kohanim. They wait till he's 7. So Atalia gets 6 years. He's an infant apparently at the hiding. And Atalia rules for 6 years. Right? And we don't hear anything about her. Much. Then, what do? This Atalia, they stage a revolution and they stage a popular revolution, and right? And they crown the baby. That's now 7 years old. And what does Athaliah scream when she hears that she's in trouble? That Yoash is now going to be the king? Oh, Keshet Kashad, right? Rebellion. Who else said that? Izebel, mommy. She is literally, it's exactly. Now this is the first time we start seeing sins in Yehudah. We have murders. We didn't have this before. We didn't have people killing people. We have all of a sudden, the Yisrael influence comes to Yehudah. We know we've got problems now. And Athaliah, this horrific woman, seems to imitate her mother. She dies similarly. And all of a sudden, and by the way, Yoash, although he starts to be a nice guy, and he seems to, the Melachim were told he's a nice guy. What happens in Melachim? We're told he's a nice guy, but what does he do at the end? So he usurps the power of the Kohanim. But we see that also in Melachim. But maybe that's because they were neglecting their jobs. But when you flip to Divrei HaYamim, he's really a bad guy. Because once Yehoiada dies, he reverts to bad practices in Divrei HaYamim. And finally, what does he do? He kills Yehoiada's son in Divrei HaYamim. He kills Zechariah. That's the famous blood of Zechariah that many years later, Nebuzaradan will slaughter people to appease the blood in the Gemaran Gittin. He kills. So all of a sudden we have these kings that are starting to revert to bad ways. And the problem begins with the influence of Yisrael. There's one other place where the problems come, and I'll just mention this. The problems also come into Yehudah, right? So Yehudah, we have this Yoash, and then we really have good kings in Yehudah. We have some pretty good guys, right? Although Uzziah and his son Yotam is, according to Rashi, never made a sin, but even Uzziah, we're told he's a good guy. Yes, he had Sarat, and we have the problem with, again, with him in Divrei Yamim, that he wanted to bring a korban, that he wanted to be maktir. But nevertheless, they're pretty decent kings that seem to have decent situations and decent lifetimes. And Am Yisrael seems to be living in a fairly secure place. The next sinner for Yehudah, and this is the next level of how the kings of Yehudah get into trouble, and this is the real big one. The next sinner is whom? Is Ahaz. Now Ahaz is a really bad guy. And Ahaz is not someone who's particularly influenced from Yisrael. As we'll see, he fights with them. And Yisrael is already on such a downward spiral right now. It's only a matter of a few years before they're going to be finished, right? Because really after the house of Yehu, we have this 5 kings that just rebellion. We only have one father-son pair. You have 4 rebellions, one after the other. Some people last for 2 years, right? You have all these kings that, don't, rebel and usurp the kingdom until Hoshea ben Elah, right? It's just all of these bad situations, and then they're destroyed. So Yisrael is not really a factor anymore, but who is the factor? This is very important to understand, and this will be like an introduction, so to speak, to our next discussion. That is Ashur. When they have an Assyrian influence on the kings of Yehudah, we have a religious, cultural influence. Ashur seems to be a seriously religious place, aside of a military power. And when the kings make, alignments with Ashur, as Ahaz clearly does, as Menashe does, they become strongly culturally influenced, and the worst forms of Avodah Zara penetrate into Yehudah. Pay close attention as we come. It's always situated with an Assyrian alliance. Always. It's in the alliance with Ashur. Hizkiah, the good guy, he fights Ashur. Right? The bad guys align with Ashur, and they become impacted. Ahaz actually brings in a Assyrian Mizbeach in. So that's the next step of where things go wrong for the kings of Yehuda, which we'll talk further later. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.